Good day everyone. I have another really cool vintage computer to show you today. This is a custom built socket 7 machine which I saved from the e-waste pile. Now when I originally took this thing I figured it was a socket 3 486 system because of course it's got the turbo button. But I was slightly surprised it was a socket 7 system. Slightly disappointed, but I'm not disappointed anymore because I've never owned a socket 7 computer. I've owned one super socket 7 computer, the Compact Presario 5360. This is my first just normal socket 7 system, so I'm glad I've got it nonetheless, and of course it's still a really cool computer. So yeah, it's in this AT mini tower case. And you know, the first thing I thought of when I first saw this computer in the e-waste pile is I thought, wow, that's the cutest 486 machine I've ever seen. Because it is really tiny. This is a really tiny case. It's only a foot tall. And, well, actually, it's not that tiny. Putting it directly side by side with the Turbo 486, it's actually a little bit wider, and it's about as long. Or it's about as deep, I should say, but it is a couple of inches shorter. That is, if you were comparing to the Turbo 486 as if it was a tower. But it is a lot smaller than what you usually find with AT towers. So it's pretty cool. So if I remember right, this thing was built around 1997, and it's a really cool computer. So let's take a look at it. First of all, we've got a CD-ROM drive. The CD-ROM drive in this thing did not work. It detected in Windows just fine, but when you put in a CD, any type of CD, music CD, data CD, whatever, it would just do nothing. So I replaced it with this drive, which is slightly newer. I think it's a 42 or 48X drive, and it works just fine. Floppy disk drive, it works just fine. And of course we got the power button, hard power button, as well as reset and turbo buttons. And of course, being a socket 7 machine, the motherboard has no turbo functionality on it. So yeah, this is a circumstance in which the system builder did not correctly match the motherboard to the case. Or maybe this thing was originally a 486 and it was upgraded to a socket 7 system later. I don't know. But whatever the case, the motherboard is not correctly matched to this case. The turbo feature does not work. It does have an LED display, which is really cool. This is where the badge would have gone. None on this system. It's got a crack in the plastic right there. It's too bad, but it's not bad. It's also got a little dent right there. It's alright. Nothing bad. So on the back, we've got AT power supply, complete with pass-through for a monitor, our AT keyboard port, parallel and serial ports, as well as a 25-pin serial port, video card, modem, Ethernet, and a sound card. This thing was decked out pretty good. And you know, one of the reasons I love these AT machines is because they didn't come with any onboard hardware. You got your parallel and serial and keyboard, and that was it. The video, the sound, everything else you had to add manually, so you were forced to make your own informed decision, or maybe not informed decision, but hopefully an informed decision on what video and sound you wanted to have, and that's really cool. These AT machines are fully customizable. Now, of course, even a modern computer with onboard video and sound, you can still choose your own hardware. But with these, you get the full experience because you have to do it. You have no choice. So it's kind of cool. We do have an open slot here. Something used to be there, I don't know. And yeah, that's about it for the outside. Now let's take this thing apart. There's 4 screws. And the whole outside lifts off. With the outside of the case off, here's inside. The motherboard was manufactured by DTK. I think I've heard of them before. Did some reading, and as far as I've read, they made pretty good motherboards. I don't know if they're still around or not. But this board has an Intel chipset, and that's awesome. It's an Intel PCI set, 82371SB. So yeah, I haven't I don't know anything about that particular Intel chipset, but Intel chipsets in general are usually very, very good, so I was happy to find that in this computer. It takes 72-pin RAM, 4 slots. I forget what was originally in this thing. I think 48 megs of RAM. Let's see, I think it had two 16 megabyte sticks and two 8 megabyte sticks. 48 I think this originally had. I've upgraded it to 64. And I haven't been able to find any information on the motherboard, but I would assume it could take up to probably 128 or 256 megabytes. There's the PC speaker, which plugs directly into the motherboard there. And the CD-ROM drive, is there a speed on it? No, but it's a 32 or it's a 42 or 48X, made in December 2001. Here's the power supply, 230 watts, no date code on it, unless that 06B is the date code, so probably 1996, that'd make sense. Now let's take a look at the processor, and that's where things get a little bit more interesting. Let's take this heatsink out and see what we have for a CPU. There's the processor, get a load of that. It's a Cyrix 6X86, another Cyrix processor. I was quite surprised, I was surprised to get just one Cyrix processor, that IBM 5X86C, in the last computer I showed, but I open this thing up, I find another Cyrix processor. That's pretty cool. Here is the processor freed from the motherboard. Now in the video of the Atlantic Socket 3 computer, you can hear me go over a brief history of Cyrix, but I'll quickly go over it again here. Cyrix, like AMD, they were a competitor to Intel, usually being able to offer processors that were faster and cheaper than Intel's processors. Up to and including the 486 era. When the Pentium came out, it threw both AMD and Cyrix for a loop because the Pentium had such a massive improvement over the 486 in the floating point department. Due to the Pentium's huge increase in floating point performance, AMD and Cyrix, they didn't know how to keep up, and they were a long time coming out with processors that could compete with the Pentium. AMD took almost 2 years to come out with a processor that could compete with the Pentium to some degree, the AMD K5. And Cyrix took about as long to come out with a processor that could compete with the Pentium, and that was this chip, the 6X86. Now, Cyrix, of course, as you can see in my video of the Atlantic computer, had the 5X86, the Cyrix CX 5X86, and that was technically a 5th generation processor, just because of its radical architecture, but it didn't have performance that was equivalent to a Pentium, and it only had the software compatibility of a 486. It couldn't run any software that required any use of Pentium instructions, so it was really only a 486, and it wasn't a true competitor to the Pentium, either in compatibility or performance. The 6X86, however, did a little bit better. It had pretty good performance compared to the Pentium. Floating point performance still wasn't that great. It was improved over the 5X86, but it really didn't match up to the Pentium, not at all. Now, this isn't because Cyrix was bad at making floating point units. They actually specifically designed the processor this way. Cyrix had determined that most personal computer software made use of integer calculations, and that is indeed true, at least at the time. So Cyrix said, okay, let's focus all our efforts on making a good arithmetic logic unit. They designed it to have as good integer performance as they could possibly get, and then whatever resources they had left over, then put that into the floating point performance. And it actually did work. The 6X86 had massively better integer performance than the Pentium. It was a huge improvement over the Pentium. And that means that overall, clock for clock, at the same clock speed, overall, in most cases, the Cyrix 6X86 is faster than the Intel Pentium. That's pretty great. Good call, to engineer the processor that particular way. However, floating point performance did suffer. People who bought the Cyrix 6x86 hoping to pair it with a 3D accelerated video card to play 3D games on their computer ended up being disappointed. As a result of the 6x86's anemic floating point unit, things that were floating point heavy like 3D games and other 3D graphic software like CAD software and stuff, performance was very poor compared to the Pentium. So for the most part, the 6x86 got mixed reviews. People who ran, business software and stuff that relied mostly on integer calculations, they thought it was great. People who wanted to game, they didn't think it was very great. Now, that wasn't the only drawback to the 6x86. This next drawback is a rather major one. The 6x86, like the 5x86, still cannot run Pentium-specific software. Any software that requires a Pentium processor, the 6x86 cannot run. This chip still, like the 5x86, the 6x86 still only has software compatibility equivalent to a 486. So in terms of software compatibility, you could still classify this as a 486 processor, and that's pretty darn bad. There was one small saving grace though. Unlike the 5x86, the 6x86 actually had its own set of Pentium-like instructions. So this chip had instructions that, when utilized properly, could yield performance improvements similar to that of the Pentium when software took advantage of Pentium-specific instructions, but they aren't Pentium compatible. But if you were a software developer and you wanted to write a program that could run as fast as possible on a Cyrix 6x86, you could make use of the Cyrix-specific instructions. And a couple of software developers did. They did release Cyrix-specific versions of some software programs. So that's kind of cool, but because the Pentium was of course the standard, and they're not compatible with the Pentium, most software doesn't take advantage of the special features of this chip, and that really hampered this chip's reception. So to summarize, the Cyrix 6x86 did provide faster integer performance than the Pentium. This is just running 486 specific software. Quite a bit slower in floating point than the Pentium though. Could not run Pentium-specific software, but it did have its own special set of instructions that could be utilized if software developers so desired. Other than that, in overall performance for just about everything except 3D stuff, the Cyrix 6x86 was faster than the Pentium. So in that regard, it was quite a successful processor. It was a successful processor. It sold pretty well. I believe it sold better than the 5x86, in fact. Other information, like the 5x86, IBM did make the Cyrix 6x86 as well, and I think SGS Thompson did as well. The only other thing I can think of about the 6x86 was it had one other minor issue. It ran much hotter than the Pentium. I believe a Pentium at the time dissipated about 15 watts of power, and I believe this chip dissipated about 25 watts. And that spelt bad news for Cyrix because they couldn't scale it very well. They couldn't get it to run as fast as they wanted to. I believe the fastest that the 6x86 was ever made in was 133 megahertz. And that was bad news because eventually the Pentium reached 150, 166, 200 megahertz, and Cyrix couldn't get this chip to run that fast. It ran too hot, it was too unstable, they couldn't cool it properly. And that was too bad. And that actually spelled the beginning of the end of Cyrix. And of course, more and more software becoming Pentium specific as time went on, because eventually AMD came out with the K6 and that was Pentium compatible, and that left Cyrix behind AMD and especially behind Intel eventually. Cyrix came out with a successor to the 6x86. It was called the 6x86MX. It added MMX instructions and a couple of Pentium instructions. So it could run a small amount of Pentium software, but not a lot, especially compared to the AMD K6, which ran nearly 100% of Pentium software. And the 6x86MX was the last processor Cyrix ever made. They went out of business eventually. They couldn't keep up. They fell behind in performance. They fell behind in technological advancements, and that was the end of Cyrix. So, too bad. A sad end to a really great processor manufacturer. They were great right up until the Pentium came out, and they couldn't keep up afterwards. Too bad. This processor had its limitations, but it's a nice piece of history nonetheless. Pretty cool. I'm glad I have it. So this is the P150 model. It runs at 120 megahertz, and it was touted as being as fast as a 150 megahertz Pentium. Now this top piece here, this is gold, and the pins are gold as well. And that's cool and all, but it's also kind of sad because gold scrappers love microprocessors. They will go on eBay and they'll buy vintage microprocessors and just separate the gold from them, thus destroying the processor, and they'll cash in the gold. And the Cyrix 6x86 actually has some of the most gold that you can find in x86 microprocessors. The only x86 processors ever made that have more gold are the AMD K5, the original P5 Pentium, and I believe the P5 4C, and the Intel Pentium Pro, which has the most gold. And I hate that. I hate gold scrappers that buy microprocessors, these vintage microprocessors that probably still work just fine, and destroy them just to make, $20 off the gold. I hate it so much, it boils my blood. But this example has survived, works just fine, and it'll continue to do so as long as I own it. The outside part here and the underside is ceramic. I like that. I like ceramic microprocessors. They have a nice heft to them. They feel physically very well built and high quality. And if we look on the bottom here, it says copyright 1995, Cyrix USA. And there's another date on here, November 20th, 1996. So perhaps that was the date this was installed in the computer. So yeah, the computer would have been made in late 1996, early 1997. Now, came with this heatsink, and the Cyrix 6x86 is one of the first processors that actually had heating issues. You needed a really good cooling system to keep them cool. It's got this heatsink and fan. This fan is not original. I put this fan on it. And this fan actually came from the Turbo 486. And the reason I put the Turbo 486's fan on this is because the original fan did work, but it was incredibly noisy. It was a ball bearing fan, and the ball bearings, kind of vibrated as the fan spun, and it would sound like a friggin' airplane. It would vibrate against the motherboard, and the motherboard would vibrate against the case, and this thing would buzz really loud because of the fan. And I tried oiling the fan, and well, that did nothing because it's a ball bearing fan. I figured it wouldn't, but I tried it anyway. And eventually, I was testing, slightly unscrewing the fan while it was running, seeing if that made it any quieter. And at one point, my screwdriver accidentally hit the running fan, and it sheared one of the blades off. So I have the fan here, and I'll show you. It's actually a Cyrix 686 specific fan. It came with the processor. So there it is, Cyrix 686. It sheared one of the blades off, my screwdriver did while it was running. This fan spins super fast, and it actually blows a ton more air than this fan does. But yeah, it was just spinning it like this right now, I can feel it vibrating. It was a really loud fan. Of course, now with those missing blades, it vibrates even more. I broke one blade off, and then I thought, well, maybe if I shear another on the other side off, it'll balance out a bit. And then I realized, it's not symmetrical. So yeah, this fan's garbage. I will cut it off and save this Molex thing. So I'm using the Turbo 486's fan for now, and it works okay. It doesn't move nearly as much air as the original fan, and as a result the processor does run a bit hot. Not so hot that it worries me, but it is a little warmer than I'd like, whereas the original fan, just made it, a little bit below too hot to touch, with this fan it does get too hot to touch. But it doesn't get any hotter than barely too hot to touch, so I'm not going to worry. But I would like to get another fan, a better fan, to put in this thing. So I'll put it back together and we'll continue checking this thing out. For a hard drive, I chose a 2.1 gigabyte Quantum Fireball. And let's take a look at the expansion cards. Now the video card kind of surprises me because it's a really underpowered video card for a system of this regime. It's a Cyrix Logic GD5440 PCI video card. And I really think that's underpowered because it's not even a 3D accelerated card. You know, certainly a Socket 7 system could take advantage of 3D acceleration. So yeah, I'll keep it in for this video, but I will be switching that card out for something a bit better. I have an ATI Rage Pro Turbo that I think would work very well with this system. There's the modem. It's a Rockwell modem. And the Ethernet card is a D-Link DE220P. It's a 10 megabit Ethernet card, so that's kind of cool. And then the sound card is a Creative Labs Sound Blaster Vibra 16. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Oh, I don't think I mentioned the parallel port was missing one of these screw things here, so I just put a standard screw there in just to keep it in place. And it's got the knockouts there. And yeah, that's pretty much all there is to show inside this thing. We've got 3 PCI slots and 4 ISA slots, and there's the CR2032 coin cell. It's got an Award BIOS, and this heatsink right here for the voltage regulator for the processor, this gets blazing hot. You burn yourself if you even come near that. I can't believe how hot it gets, and the motherboard's not discolored or anything. That's crazy. I don't know if it should be, or if maybe that Cyrix processor, you know, it draws more power than a Pentium, and it's just slightly overloading that voltage regulator. I don't know, but this big heatsink gets blazing hot. I couldn't believe it. I make a point of making sure I keep wire away from it, because certainly it would melt it. Well, I think that's all there is to show for this thing. Let's boot it up. Alright, we're all ready to boot up. So for a keyboard, I'm using my awesome Acer Model 6011 mechanical AT keyboard from 1991. And this very nice Microsoft Serial Mouse, which I saved from the e-waste pile. And this HD TV for the monitor. So what operating system did I put on this? Well, you know, this thing would have originally had Windows 95 on it, and Windows 95 would certainly be a good fit for this. But I've already got a computer with Windows 95, that Socket 3 system I showed in the last video, and I like to have a bit of diversity among my collection of computers, so I chose to put Windows 98 on this. Windows 98, I think, is still an equally good fit. This computer might be slightly underpowered with Windows 98, but not bad. But anyway, let's boot it up, and we'll go into the BIOS. And there we go. Now something I want to mention, notice how this says 150, but it's a 120 megahertz processor. I have a suspicion that whoever sold this computer, because the processor is branded as a P150, I have a suspicion that whoever sold this computer set this to 150 and sold it as a 150 megahertz computer, even though it is not. Very, very sneaky. And if you turn turbo off, remember turbo's not connected, it just says 00. They didn't bother setting it to say something legible. So here's the BIOS, standard Award BIOS. Nothing much to see here. It's got a bit of settings. Most of them I don't know what they do. You can set the RAM timing, which is interesting. It seems to work in either setting. I think this has 70 nanosecond RAM in it, but I set it to 60 nanosecond. and it works just fine. I think this recovery time, I think this is the wait states. Yeah, I think this might be wait state, I'm not sure. Chipset special features, I don't know what those special features are, but it says enabled or disabled. I guess I'll leave it as it is. So yeah, there's that. It also does low-level format of the hard drive. That's cool. So we will exit and boot up. Notice how the Energy Star logo fades out. I think that's kind of cool. But here we go anyhow, Windows 98 2nd edition. And I do have sound hooked up, so you'll hear the startup sound. Very nice. So all the hardware is detected. Actually, I think the modem. Let me see. I think there's one thing. Yeah, there's one. It detects the Ethernet card, so the modem it hasn't detected. That doesn't matter. I'll be removing it anyway. But yeah, here it is. I don't have anything installed for software. But here we can see Cyrix instead, 6x86, 64 megabytes of RAM. There's a video card, and it works just fine. I guess there's only 1 megabyte of video memory, because at 1024 it only does 256 colors, and then 16-bit at 800, and then 24-bit at 640. And no 3D acceleration, so I can go into a 3D screensaver here. And frame rate's not bad. That processor pushes it along pretty good, but it would obviously be improved once I get a 3D accelerated video card in there. Yeah, this handles Windows 98 pretty good. It's pretty snappy for what it is. Faster than that 486, that Cyrix 5x86 under Windows 95. Yeah, I think Windows 98's a good fit for this. And yeah, that's pretty much all there is to show. So I'm not going to be keeping this computer in its original configuration. Not only am I going to be upgrading the video card and maybe the sound card, I'm not sure, and maybe the network card, I'm also not sure about that. But I'm actually going to be swapping the motherboard into another case. I'm going to be making a video in which I take this machine, the Cyrix 5x86 socket 3 machine, and the Turbo 486, and I'm going to gut all three of them and rearrange all the components, motherboard, CPUs, RAM, everything, expansion cards. I'm going to be reconfiguring them into what I think would be a more appropriate configuration for each of them. That should be a pretty interesting video. I'll be looking forward to making that one, because I like tearing things apart, or tearing computers apart. I don't like tearing everything apart, but I like tearing computers apart and putting them back together. And yeah, I think I'll be fitting this with a socket 3 motherboard, and then I'll be putting the socket 7 motherboard in that computer since that doesn't have a turbo button. So, we'll shut this down. And where it's an AT machine, we get the prompt to manually turn off the computer. So there you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed this really cool vintage computer, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye. Would you believe the motherboard in this is a PC Chips M919, the exact same motherboard that's in the Turbo 486, which you can see down there. Same motherboard. I was really surprised, although I shouldn't be. It was a common motherboard. Look at that. 56 moves to the upper line, and it actually shows the multiplication symbol there. Is that awesome or what? And I can hit equals, and then it shows the answer in the bottom line.